Hey everyone and welcome. We're about to go down to my wormery, and like we do sometimes, we're going to take a quick look at my tracking spreadsheet to come up with what our game plan for today is. So you can already see I've updated the spreadsheet to include an annotation here for 4 of my bins to get fed. And those are a couple of red wiggler tubs as well as a couple of VermiBags that have nightcrawlers in them. When we feed the VermiBag Mini with the European nightcrawlers, we're going to be looking at that one from the perspective of maybe using that container to set up a new time-lapse using one of my spare cameras that I've got laying around right now. A lot of times I've got multiple time-lapses running at once. Right now I've got this camera available to set something up, and I was thinking about using that VermiBag Mini, since it's got this clear plastic view portal where you can peek into the bin. I figured setting up the camera in front of that, peering down into the contents of the bin, maybe having some Christmas lights inside to illuminate the scene gently, but not so much that it would scare the worms down under the surface. So when we go down there to feed that bin, we're going to be looking at that bin from that perspective, and the other 3 bins are basically just getting fed normal run-of-the-mill feeding for those. So, but before we go down into the wormery, let's also acknowledge the fact that today is the worm moon. That's right, the full moon in March every year, like every month, has its own name. And you might have heard of some of these. Harvest Moon, Neil Young sings, has an album called Harvest Moon, and some of these other moon names you might have heard before. And the one that is special today is the worm moon. It's the March full moon every year, and this year, 2020, it happens on March 9th. So happy worm moon. Let's go feed the worms. So as you can see here, my VermiBag has got some special equipment on here. I got some bubble wrap going around the side. I'm using a little binder clip to hold it together, and different things going on. The whole idea of the plastic being to keep the moisture in so that it doesn't evaporate so much moisture away. But down here is where you can see this VermiBag's got a little view panel, and it's dark in there now, but if I were to set up a couple lights and remove that piece of cardboard that's in the way and have the GoPro camera mounted over here, then possibly we can get a view of the activity on the top surface of the bin if the lights that I put in there are not too strong to scare the worms away. So that's one of the ideas I want to explore there today. I've got this piece of board which has the GoPro mount screwed down to it, and that could somehow get attached here with some screws, and that would be half the battle right there. So that's just some of my ideas. So I figured I'd share that with you really quick before we get to feeding. So all right, let's get up onto the bench and start feeding. The stuff I plan to feed with today is just a variety of carrot peels, cantaloupe melon rinds, cuttings from strawberries, and I thought I had some chunks of pineapple in here. Not much, but a few pieces, some of these meatier pieces. The outer husk of the pineapple, I left that for the outside compost container. And like we always do, I've got coffee here to include with the feeding, as well as some nice shredded newspaper. The only other thing, I've got an interesting little thing that I'm not sure how we're going to include in the feeding is this little roll, or I guess loaf of bread if you want to consider it that. A little bit of a baking experiment which didn't go quite as planned. Let me explain. Does that help explain? So whatever, I figured since today is the worm full moon, we would be able to use a whole loaf of some sort of breadish material if I could figure out how to break it. have to soak this thing if I want to use it this way, but for now, maybe I'll set it aside. We'll give it a try another time, unless I can figure something out. All right, let's get to work. See, right here, peekaboo. The idea would be that the camera would look in through here and observe the worm activity below. The paper feels a little damp. We did moisten it considerably last time we were here. And like we did last time, we're going to peel off this paper from the top so we can gain access, a little bit better view of what we're doing. And you know what? Let me turn on a light overhead. That should help a lot too. Oh, that's better. Much easier to see. So yeah, we're going to just use this handy dandy green tub to pull out this paper off the top, just so we can see what we've got going. As we usually see, there are a couple worms hanging out near the surface. Some of the stuff I'm seeing here on top looks like it might be coffee from previous feedings. I can't remember everything that was placed in here last time. Breaking down quite nicely. One thing you might remember from last time too was that I had sort of promised myself not to go burrowing down into this container when I feed or when I'm doing maintenance. It's the type of container that's really just supposed to be fed on the top, and all the resulting castings are just meant to drop to the bottom, and then those materials get harvested from the bottom through an opening. So the whole design of this is, you know, screaming, do not excavate, do not burrow, and I just keep ignoring that. So I've already, you know, decided for a couple weeks now that I'm not going to continue doing that. So we don't really get to see so many worms in this bin because of that. But we got at least to see a few here roaming around on the top surface. So like I said, this is going to be receiving a top feeding. Let's grab a couple items to throw on top and get these guys fed. Okay, carrots and strawberries. What I believe is the insides of maybe an apple or a pear, maybe a pear. And here we have a couple rinds of a cantaloupe. So I'm not going to be feeding as heavily as I often do. A lot of times you see me adding a lot more food than this. So I'm going to be going a little bit lighter today, only because of the amount of food that I bought downstairs today is not so much. I've got to, you know, let it last for all 4 feedings that we got to do today. The one thing I'll never skimp on though, because I've always got plenty of it, is the coffee grounds. So they'll go right on top like they usually do. And that's it. So now while this is filming, I don't know exactly what the best approach might be. Maybe putting in large, complete pieces of something to see how the worms climb up onto it and eat it and stuff. That seems a little bit more interesting than just putting down a big, you know, pile of pureed, pulverized food or whatever for them. So I don't know. Different ideas. I'm listening. Give me some ideas if you've got ideas. All right, let's get this thing covered up and move on to the next one. Paper has a nice consistency to it from a moisture perspective. It's not terribly dry, but it's not damp either, so I'm going to add water. We'll also dampen this top paper like we did last time as well. That was what we did last time, and it seemed to hold up good over these past 11 days, and if that works, stick with it. Now the VermiBag tote, it has African nightcrawlers in it. The VermiBag mini that we just fed, the flow-through system's European nightcrawlers. They're somewhat different worms from what I understand. They're both nightcrawlers, but these Africans are supposed to be a little bit more geared towards living in warm temperatures. So down here in my basement, I sometimes wonder if they're if their feeding activity might be stunted a little bit because of the colder temperatures. Here I've got 2 coffee filters because I tried something new last week and I fed this bin in both locations here. Usually I just have one particular feeding zone, but this time I figured I would try feeding in 2 different locations. And I think the main reason for that was because we found a fairly large amount of remaining food from the previous feeding down the middle. So perhaps here we could sort of do a quick assessment first and then take those next steps after we decide what might be the best bed here. We're going to do the same thing as we did in the VermiBag Mini, is pick off this topping paper, give us a little bit better view of what's happening down here in the feeding zones, or in the bag in general. Don't need to remove all of it, just try to give ourselves a view of what's happening. So you can see the difference in color here, the slightly lighter material on this outer edge. I would think that's the coffee from the last feeding. Same over here. See some of these paper towels that we used as sort of a bedding for that last feeding. It's pretty dry over here in the new feeding zones. It's kind of risky, you know, because there's a lot of fabric around the edge, and on these dry winter days, I've got forced hot air in my house, so the air is always very dry as a result of that. I sometimes worry about the moisture levels in my wormery, but this is promising. You know, I poked down in here and right away I could see some worms hanging out, apparently comfortable enough that they're coming to take advantage of the food that's been placed in there during the last feeding. Although there doesn't seem like there's a lot of it, so that's a good sign too. Glad to see that. Curious, let's see how things look on this other side. Banana peel. There's a hunk of corn, one of these pieces of food that's been in this bin for months now. Here too, I see bits and pieces of the old bedding. There's a couple worms right there hanging down in that material too. So even though it feels a little dry to me, the worms being there is a good sign, I think, that says things are not too dangerous there yet. Starting to think that maybe the best bet for this bin would be for me to give each of these old feeding zones from 11 days ago a nice little spray of water on both sides, and then we're going to put new food down the middle, because prior to that 11 days where the food was added here, I think it might have been another 10 or 11 days since food was added down the middle, so maybe we can make ourselves a little bit of space down the middle to add today's feeding for these African nightcrawlers. I'm spraying the worms themselves. They're pretty docile. I think if I were to spray red wigglers like that, they would immediately react. These African nightcrawlers don't seem to mind so much. Alright, so I guess we'll just move things off to the edge here a little bit. You can already see like pieces of egg carton here. Other pieces of old bedding, paper, whatnot. I guess if we encounter anything here, I know we pulled a whole bunch of it out, so there's a whole bunch of it right there within arm's reach, but I figured if some of it's already here, maybe we'll gather that, and we'll use that partially to lay down as bedding within the feeding zone today. Some more cardboard. I guess it's going back a couple feedings at this point. Let's see if we can make some room for this next feeding. I gotta say, down the middle is a different story. I do have a piece of wood resting right below the bin, and then this strap, the center strap, goes right beneath it. So I've got something, basically a barrier, covering the bottom, preventing evaporation from escaping through the bottom of the bin. So I think that probably has a lot to do with the fact that right down the middle over here there's a good amount of moisture. This tomato goes way back. I'm gonna pop it. So I like the moisture. There are hunks of bedding we could recycle a little bit. Food I don't see so much, and that makes sense, you know, going back who knows how many weeks now, at least a couple weeks. maybe even 3 weeks. Down the middle here is the last time fresh food was added down here, so I think we've got room for it down here. Not a very big feeding anyway, so we should be able to find space for it pretty easily. Okay, I'm going to just start putting some of this bedding down in here. But before I do, I just figured I would agitate this a little bit, create some air pockets, try to make sure none of this material really has a chance to settle down so much that the airflow completely stops and starts to get really nasty. So a little bit of air always helps a lot for the microbial, microscopic life forms that live in your worm bins. Guess that's most of the stuff that we scraped aside that we thought would be good, useful, reusable stuff for bedding. Let's get these old corn pieces in here. Then we could sprinkle in some of these carrots, as well as some of this melon. Go with a little strawberry and a piece of pineapple too. All right, looking good. You might have noticed I'm not adding grit today. I did review my video from the last feeding, and it did seem like I was pretty generous with the grit last time, so I'm going to skip adding grit this time. I'm sure they're just fine from that point of view. Hopefully the moisture I sprayed in on the outer edges is sufficient. It might be a good idea, and I know I said this last week too, but I definitely didn't keep to it. Last week too, or last feeding too, I did mention how during these dry winter days it would probably make good sense for me to check in on these regularly to make sure moisture levels don't get into dangerously low situations here, but I did not do that, so this bin has not been, this bag, none of these bins have been opened since they were fed 11 days ago. All right, I think we're in pretty good shape here. As you can see, this stuff is a little bit muddy, damp down the middle, so much so that it's sticking all over my gloves. No big deal. Every worm bin's a little bit different. Sometimes they do get a little bit more damp, and the worms actually seem to favor that. Just towards the end, you probably want to start thinking about letting the bin dry out a little bit. That always makes harvesting the compost at the end a little bit easier if it's not all muddy and sticky. Okay, onto the red wigglers. Oops, I almost forgot to put the paper back on top. I'll go take care of that now, but I won't bring the bag back out onto the table. I'll take care of that, and we'll get the red wigglers out here next. Alrighty, so red wigglers are my worm type of, I wouldn't say choice. I would just say that they're the worm type that I have in the largest quantities. This is only one of, I would say, 4 bins, or maybe, I guess you can almost count the outside worm bin as a 5th full bin that's primarily red wigglers. You know, as opposed to European nightcrawlers, African nightcrawlers, each occupying 1 bin only each. So, this bin, as you might have noticed, had the coffee filter positioned over here, indicating that it was last fed right over here where you can see the moldy coffee. And as we start to peel back a little bit, right away, right below the surface, there's, you know, a combination of really nice castings, and right away a whole bunch of movement where the worms have been congregating here, digging into their most recent feeding. Banana peel, some sort of citrus peel, but so far gone that I just touch it and it collapses under the touch of my hand. This is some sort of paper, again falling apart in my hands. So I guess if I find any pieces of larger food chunks. We'll try to keep them over there. And we'll start peeling back to make more room. Again, out on this very furthest edge to keep driving the worms further and further away from what's now going to be treated as finished compost down there on this far edge. At the same time, if while I'm manipulating any of this stuff that should be considered as finished compost soon, I'll pick out any large chunks and move them into the area where the activity is going to be happening. Over here where the feedings are going to be continued. Over here where the feedings are not going to be continued, you'd like to start thinking that it's castings only, but there is other stuff mixed in here, other hunks of large bedding, whatever. You know, if the worms don't get it, at some point maybe there'll be an opportunity to screen it out. But like if, you know, it's easy enough to just grab a piece of obvious material that's still kind of large, I'll always try to pull it out and try to sort of start pre-screening this compost ahead of time and eliminating anything from it that just doesn't have a chance of really being finished compost anytime soon. A little bit dry over there too. The dryness should also end up becoming sort of a catalyst for the worms moving out. So I'm not going to sweat that too much in terms of trying to rehydrate it. If it starts to become really hard, kind of like a big brick, then maybe I'll reconsider and try to add some moisture. But maybe it's just sufficient enough to reach down deep and grab some moisture from some of the compost that's down below and move that to the top. I guess this would also give us a chance to look for any sort of slow composting items like this this seed, big seed. It's from a mango. Usually it's the inside that they're most interested in, but that's definitely going to go over there with the rest of the stuff that needs to remain in a active feeding zone. If we hit any other larger pieces of stuff like banana stem right there, we could pull it out. But luckily I'm not seeing too much stuff like that. It looks like they've done a fairly good job breaking the majority of it down. So here too, I think sometimes it just helps to maintain a good amount of airflow down within the material, so I'm not opposed to occasionally stirring the material around a little bit. Luckily, I think these types of worms, the red wigglers, don't seem to mind it too much either. So we'll just keep moving stuff off to the far edge from where the feedings are occurring. Trying to rotate some of the more moist stuff from the bottom up, and at the same time picking out large items that should really be in part of the active feeding zone and not mixed up in the almost finished castings. Okay, so at this point, no more picking through. Anything that's this close to this far edge is stuff we can definitely consider as still active. We're just going to go to the very, very far outer edge and do our feeding there. Yeah, I know in the beginning I talked about trying to really do away with as much of this paper as possible, but every time I come into one of these bins and I find a lot of remaining bedding type material, I'm often feeling like I should just reuse that if possible. But here, I think I could probably make a little bit of space to go ahead and use some fresh bedding. I'll throw in some of these egg carton pieces, but we'll also drop in a little bit of fresh bedding as well. Always a good idea to dampen any of this really dry stuff. See how the red wigglers react to getting sprayed. See? They're a little bit more responsive. when they get wet and they feel it, they almost always immediately react. Not like those lackadaisical night crawlers. Hopefully that's just their normal behavior, and I'm not dealing with some sickly, problematic night crawlers. We're almost there. Let's go ahead and add some food. All right, very similar. Another hunk of this cantaloupe. What was this? Pineapple. Mostly cantaloupe rinds, some carrot peels, even a little strawberry. And I think we're leaving enough food to take care of the final bin as well. We'll just grab one more piece of melon rind for them right here. Okay, I think we've got ourselves a nice feeding zone here. We'll take some of this active food and pepper it in over here. Let some of the microbes that are already at work on some of this existing food start breaking down some of the new food so that the worms can get in there as well and start making good use of it. Now, I guess I'm going to need some sort of a bedding-like material to cover this with, and I think I'd like to use leaves here. And grab a few handfuls of leaves that we can sprinkle across the top. And I think that'll be good. Stuff's pretty fine. One should appreciate that. Easy to break down. Small particle size. But since it is dry too, a little bit of moisture for that's going to be a nice addition as well. So I kind of like the idea of picking through this compost, even though it's a long way away from being depopulated and truly ready for use out in the garden. I like the idea of picking through it to remove anything that's definitely going to take so long that it just makes no sense for it to be out there anymore, and moving it into the active zone. So we'll probably do that in future feedings here as well on this finishing tub. So I guess that's kind of what I consider this bin as being, and is sort of like a finishing stage at this point, giving what's more or less finished compost here an opportunity to sort of wind down and get depopulated, but I'm sure that's going to take some time. So we'll be tracking its progress and doing whatever we can to help move it ahead. I think we can tell quite clearly where the feeding zone is, but just to be consistent, we're going to stick to marking it. Sometimes when that top material looks just like everything else, you really can't tell where you did this. But today's feeding is quite clear where we've been revamping the horizontal feeding zone over here. All right. I'm so glad I'm using these additional layers of cardboard nowadays too. It seems like it's helping a lot keeping the moisture in. All right, one more bin to go. All right, so I don't know. It's something about this bin. It's not my oldest or anything like that, but it's by far the heaviest. So it's the one reason I think that it's probably the most active of my bins and probably has the greatest number of worms in it as well. So all right, let's get to work on this one. On this bin, I can somehow see the incline is so much greater. It seems like it's just sloped down much more than it did in any other bin where the feeding zone was. Again, I think being sort of a clue that this is probably one of my more active bins, or possibly my most active bin. All right, so nice, little fresh castings all over the place, some little bit of moisture. And you could tell just from touching it how soft it is that there's just worms right there beneath the surface. But before we go there, let's just get a sense of how things look on this edge. Top is dry. Anything that's dry over on this edge, I think, like last time too, we're not going to treat it as a huge problem. but we are going to try to agitate some of the more dry material in with some of the more damp material. Try to help things remain in equilibrium over here on the far end a little bit. And I guess at the same time also helping to maintain airflow throughout the material, because the microscopic life forms need that to be as efficient as possible, continuing to break all this stuff down. I'm not really encountering too many large chunks of anything. Probably be a banana stem right here. I think this might be one as well. Very, far along, quite a bit broken down. The material I'm pulling up, you can see is, I wouldn't say muddy, right? Because if it was muddy, I think you'd be able to squeeze it and a lot of moisture would come sopping out of it. It breaks apart pretty readily. It's just not flaky. It's not dry enough to be considered flaky. But I don't think it would take long to get that way if you wanted it to be that way. Give this a little bit of time to air out and it would be stuff they could probably run through a sifter pretty readily and get some really fine sifted stuff out of it. So this bin is very, very efficient. It just breaks everything down rapidly. It's highly populated. I think that's the main reason. So I'm always very pleased when I've got at least one bin that functions the way this one does, because this one is just, kind of an ideal example of how this stuff should work. You can tell this stuff is really beautiful. It's probably got a fair amount of residual food material in it, and it's probably it's such a crowded bin. I'm sure the worms do whatever they can to find their own little space of this heaven, but probably don't find any place where they can really have a moment to themselves. So yeah, I definitely like what I'm seeing here. Not sure what that was. Anything we encounter that's from a previous feeding is pretty much indistinguishable from whatever's next to it. It's just a big bunch of gooey mush, except for these pits. It's funny, you can hear the inside of it still kind of dry and wobbling around inside like a maraca. So this one needs a little bit more time. It's not at that point yet. Here it's a little bit more damp, which makes sense because this is where the feedings have been occurring. You can tell there's a lot of worms hanging out here. Let's see if we can avoid spilling. Here again, if I see large chunks over here on the side where it's supposed to be mainly finished castings at this point, I'll move them over. But anything that's this side, of the center, I'm just going to treat that as all active feeding zone. So I'm not going to move stuff from here to there. This pit, I think we'll just keep it somewhere near the middle. It's pretty awesome. Let's see if we can move the last of this stuff over a bit and do a reload. This would have been what we added 11 days ago. See some of the bedding material that was used during that feeding. Here's a banana stem, a little bit of the peel remaining, little bits of food here and there, but just so many worms and such nice moisture level. It's not surprising that little, if anything, is really recognizable as what it was. I'm also seeing some of the mold from the bread that was down in there from a couple feedings ago, but that's just dust at this point. This might be bread, but I'm not sure. All right, we've got ourselves a nice little crevice down here. Plenty of room for the remaining food that we've got in this bag over here. So let's use a little bit more of this paper as bedding. Okay. No fanfare. Dump it all out. Again, we're seeing more of the same. It's a little bit of no food, pineapple, a little bit of acidic, but it should do fine in this amount. Carrots, we've actually got a whole carrot here. We'll keep that in the middle, see how that progresses. And then we've got these yummy cantaloupe rinds and strawberry bits everywhere else. Again, since the bin got grit last time, and a fair amount of it, I think all the bins got a fair amount of it last time, we're going to skip giving these guys any grit. Can't remember now. As I'm putting the coffee into this one, I'm feeling like I've got so much. Did I forget to put it into the last bin? That's one of my gaffes. I always screw up, and I think I did again. I always seem to forget stuff for some reason. I don't know why. Luckily, I think we've got ourselves a bin that can handle it. And we'll just give them all of what remains. Ugh, I'm really starting to lose it. It's not an exact science. As long as your main objective is to get rid of stuff like this, compostable stuff, and it's getting into a place where it's going to get taken care of, and as long as the worms that are doing it for you are also taken care of in the same vein, we're probably in good shape. All right, so that's it for today. I don't think we're going to need to dampen any other papers in this particular bin because everything is pretty nice in this bin, so we're not going to worry about wetting the paper on the top of this one. We're just going to cover it up and put it away. So besides putting away, there's going to be a little bit of cleanup here, and you know that's no fun. Look at that, covered in filth. So I'll take care of that after I shut the camera off. But before I do, let me just quickly say thank you for keeping me company. I always really appreciate that. If you enjoyed the video, please remember to give me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And also consider becoming a subscriber to the channel as well. That's always great too. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.